Please welcome Patrick Paul Garlinger to the show. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you so much for having me, Ashley. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, all the way from New York City.
Exactly.
How's the weather? What is the weather like right now? Cold?
Cold, overcast. It rained a lot last night. It's a sort of gloomy winter, but no snow. We've had no snow. So,
Oh, huh. Anyway, I love taking my girls to New York. So I've been kind of thinking of that lately. And then I see where you live, and I want to go to where I found you on the 1111 podcast with Simran. And I
yes.
do listen to her podcast here and there because there's guests on there that I know will resonate with me and that I want to. So that's where I first met you. And I got the book, Endless Awakening. It's right here.
Thank you.
After I listened, and I knew that I wanted you to come on to share your magic, because your story, the way you got to where you are, the way you've written all these books, is really, you're speaking my language of where I am at in my spiritual growth. So even reading, it was almost like I was reading a textbook in this book, because I was like, yes. And you said it a certain way in your life experience, and it's so easy to read. And I feel like you're my friend explaining to me the story that you had. And I know the other books are channeled, and this one you just wrote. That's right. But I always love looking back at knowing that everything in our life is perfect. Everything about that you talk about, the paradox, like how with this book, and the timing is perfect, because look at where this world is right now. This is where we need to be. Everyone needs to read this book.
Oh, thank you.
No, I mean that, because when the way we live right now, and the good and the bad, you should like that or you shouldn't like that, all the things, the dualities of, and to live the way you talk about in this book. Oh, beautiful. What a way to live.
Thank you. I'm doing my best to live up to my own writing. That's for sure.
Oh, so let's go to, I go back to when, like, you were in first grade and you were in Utah, and you came to school, and I'm trying to get to where you get to this, God consciousness, or, this spiritual enlightenment. Because when I look at your life as just this first grader, what, a 6-year-old, and how you just realize this moment, and how it kind of took you a while to get back to that place. Can we start there? Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. And for everyone listening, that episode when I was a little kid in like the first grade, where the other kids wouldn't play with me because of how they saw me through as a particular kind of religious figure. I was Catholic and they were Mormon. And I'm always careful when I tell that anecdote that, like, this is not an indictment of any of these religions, but the kids didn't play with me. And I was like, what? And it was really a very deep, shameful moment of feeling like, oh, there's something really wrong with this whole picture. And so, I ran away from Christianity, Catholicism, going to church. And I became really very much wedded to my mind, to logic, reason, education. I got a doctorate in Spanish literature. I was really into philosophy, theory, and then I went on to get a JD. I became a lawyer. It was like super rational. And I remember every once in a while, something spiritual crossing my path, or hearing about a psychic, and oh, my eyes rolled. Oh, I was very closed. And I remember there was a time in my life where I picked up and I discovered yoga. So one of the things I love about the way the divine works is that I was going to a gym in Atlanta, Georgia, that was, I was like a gym bunny in my 30s. And I went, and there was this power yoga class. And I said, oh, power yoga, that sounds like something I should do. I said, can I do that? I've never done it before. And the front desk person's like, sure, anybody can do it. Go ahead. I go in. It turns out it is a serious Ashtanga yoga who's like reading, like saying all the poses in Sanskrit. And I am sweating buckets. And I have no idea, but I was like, I'm going to do this. And then suddenly, meditation shows up. Another book shows up, and it just sort of began to plant tiny little seeds. That I like to refer to that period of my life as sort of the awakening that I didn't even know was an awakening stage.
Right. Right. And when you met somebody like a woman, Amma,
Mm-hmm.
is that
Yes,
another moment that kind of opened you even wider?
yeah, exactly. So I, was basically practicing yoga and very much in the world of Zen meditation. Zen was kind of my first area because it was non-deistic. It was still very intellectual. And it was like just your experience sitting. You were sitting and meditating. And I was very comfortable with that. And then I went through really like a dark night of the soul. Like my world fell apart completely. And I can get into any details you want, but in the midst of that,
Well, wait, tell me what the dark night of the soul was.
oh yeah. So I had graduated law school and I was clerking for a federal judge. And I was getting ready to sort of embark on a career. My path, because I'd been a professor and gone to law school, I thought I was going to go into legal academia. I was going to be a law professor. And yeah, God had a lot of other plans for me. I like to imagine, my guides and the divine sitting up there going, so funny.
Well,
He has no idea.
I'm not sorry to interrupt you, but I always look, and I know you talk about this too, is the Patrick that would have stayed on that journey, is he still doing that?
Is
Like
he
in
still
all
doing
different,
that?
yeah, all
I
those
do.
timelines.
We're going to come back to that. There's, in part, I think one of the aspects of my whole process is kind of coming to accept all of these sides of myself and loving them, even if I'm not living out that timeline or that dimension of myself. But I was in already a pretty overworked and unsure place, but I essentially turned down a fellowship to Harvard Law School. And it was one of those moments of my first real contact with an intuition that I had previously kind of followed when it suited me and when it kind of aligned with my intellectual things. But I was essentially waking up every morning for weeks with the most gut-wrenching nausea. And I was like, I have to turn this down. I have to turn this down. And, and then throughout the day, I'd persuade myself, no, this is the right choice. We're going to take this. This is the path. And then it would come up again. And literally, I had kind of I had a breakdown. I mean, like I turned it down and I was like, I cannot believe, who does this? My advisors are like, what are you doing? Why are you turning this down? Nobody had any rational explanation. And I was a nervous wreck. And in the midst of all that, I'm like, what am I doing with my life? I just turned this down. I burned all my bridges. Where do I go from here? And then all of a sudden, people started showing up in my life. I had a friend who was an acupuncturist who said, you should go see my friend, this person who's a psychic medium. And I was like, okay, I'm at the point where I'm like, I need help. Okay, fine. Obviously I've lost control of my life. And within that, one of the suggestions that came across my desk was go see Amma, who I'd never had any experience with any figure like that. And so I went and got in line and saw Amma. And for people who are listening who don't know, she's known as the hugging saint. She, previously, prior to the pandemic, would tour the world constantly giving people hugs. And it sounds to somebody who maybe doesn't have a framework for that, like what, why would you go get a hug from somebody? But I sat in that audience and I'd gotten there so early to be like right at the front, and in walks this very sweet, diminutive Indian woman. I mean, she's not very tall, and I was instantly welling up with tears. I'd never felt love come off of somebody like that. And when I got in line and I got to my hug, I literally just burst into tears, and I'm like heaving and sobbing into this woman. And I don't know, and she's whispering something, and it's 15 seconds. And then I'm in the corner, kind of integrating this, just filled with the most incredible light that I had ever experienced. All of this was just mind-blowing for me.
Were other people, is that what it looked like after you walked away, or before you approached her? Were people all like crying and having that experience?
I think there's a range. Some people were, clearly people who had also seen her before who could really feel that. And other people are kind of curious, like, who is this? It's always interesting to visit these events, which are known as darshans, and you see a range of people. And sometimes you see, famous people that you're like, oh, you're coming to get a hug from Amma. And
Oh,
there's definitely a mixture. And I've always had, I wouldn't say I've had the same exact experience, but I've definitely felt the same energy from her. It wasn't something that was a one-time experience. The times that I've seen her, it felt the same.
okay. So you meet Amma. It opens up this whole new, what, dimension that you're like, whoa, this is
Yeah.
this is where I could be or
Yes.
go.
Well, and it was, there were a couple, there was another critical event in there, which is that I, in the midst of all this, also had found an energy healer who became my teacher for many years. And it was the sort of thing that, again, happened because I was really in a place where I had recognized I had not listened to my intuition and I didn't know what was going on. But I remember one morning waking up and feeling this incredible urge to visit the Kripalu website. And I had never been to Kripalu. I
Huh,
had
I've never even
wanted
heard
to
that
go.
word.
Oh, yeah. And so Kripalu is a retreat center in Lenox, Massachusetts. And I had wanted to go there for a yoga retreat years prior, never made it. So I'm like, I just have to check out this website. And I pull it up and there is this, picture of a woman, an energy healer I'd never heard before. Her name was Mirabai Devi. And just a light bulb went off. And I said, I have to work with this person. And she has a tremendous capacity to sort of send light into somebody. I'd never really done any kind of energy work other than I'd had somebody do a little bit of Reiki, which was very gentle.
Right.
When she started doing what she does, I literally fell on the back of just fell on the ground. And this incredible energy was just pounding my third eye. It was just boom, boom, boom. And it was just incredible. And I remember the only thought I could think of was God exists. Like it was this moment of like, oh, God exists.
Wow.
And
Huh.
these experiences are just happening, kind of one after the other. And so then I'm on a parallel track. I'm living two lives. I became a lawyer. And then these experiences are happening.
Wow. So so you go through you're about time, the first, before you start channeling the council, were you
Yes.
into, when you started channeling the council, was that before your Kundalini?
Oh, yeah. So giving a bit of more time reference here. Yeah. So
Time,
this is
right?
all
We're talking about
starting
time.
to happen around 2010.
Okay.
2011. And so I continued to work with Mirabai for many years, doing a lot of energy healings, doing a lot of chakra cleansing, opening up the chakras, working through, a lot of karmic stuff, learning a lot about, the nature of reality, divine, how to work with forgiveness. So we're working on all this and I'm steadily clearing and healing and holding more and more energy. My meditations become so much more intense and deep and sort of constantly feeling the energy in the third eye or in the crown chakra. And it was in 2015, then after years of working and while I'm also lawyering and doing all this, in my spare time, that I have a Kundalini awakening that I completely did not expect, just unprepared for, in the sense that all the work that I had done, I thought had kind of accomplished the equivalent of a Kundalini awakening. I mean, I had cleared out a lot. So, and it happened, I just began to feel this incredible pain at the base of my spine. And for days it was there. And I thought it felt like I had worked out too hard and I had like, pull the back muscle, and I kept
Right.
stretching and I kept doing all these
Huh.
things to be like, alleviate. I was taking some Advil, doing some very typical things, thinking, okay, I've just, what did I do at the gym? And then I was kind of exhausted from this kind of constant pain. And it felt like pain, tightness. And so I laid down and I was like, I'm just going to like see if I can relax into this. And then the base of my spine exploded. It was just like a hot coal just erupted. And this energy started to move up, and it would stop at a different chakra and it would sort of stay there for a while, and it was sort of buzzing, and occasionally there'd be a release, and then it would go back down and move up. And I could just tell that this was a Kundalini arising. Like
You did know that during that time.
I did. I like right away, I was like, wow, oh, this
Huh.
is what a Kundalini rising is like.
Huh.
Coming out of the base of the spine. And so much of the work had been, receiving energy. But this was clearly originating from the base of the spine. And it was about a month into that experience that, and these experiences were really intense. They happened every day, for 45 minutes to an hour sometimes. Sometimes I was really sweating and just like purging.
Wow.
It was beautiful. And then they would subside and I would sort of relax. And then one day, it was about a month into it, I just heard this voice that I'd never heard. That was, we're going to write, and we're going to write quickly. And I was like, whoa, what is going on? And it was the beautiful voice. Like it was Divine Father, in the sense of, it was very loving, but it was also really direct. It was like, I experienced a lot of my awakening and growth happen with Divine Mother figures. So I have like a really deep love. And in a way it was perfect because, my father wasn't really present in my life. I don't have much of my own karmic history was sort of working through my relationship with male authority figures. So here comes Divine Father, like, we're going to write, and we're going to write quickly. And it identified itself as the Council of Light, a term I had never heard. I told my teacher, Maribel, and she's like, oh, I know who the Council of Light is. I've worked with, it's like,
Oh,
what?
wow.
You've never mentioned them before. And I very quickly started receiving these downloads, 15, 20 minutes at a time. It was just, I felt like droplets on the top of my head. It was like energetic rain droplets. And I just typed frantically, just typed. And in the course of 6 months, I had downloaded 3 different books. It was about 2 months each one. There was like a little bit of a break, and then the next one started, and I was like, oh no, I'm not ready for that. Because it was beautiful, but it was intense. And I would find myself in really awkward places. I remember one time I was on an airplane.
Oh, wow.
I'm just trying to type and look normal, not look like I'm like, because I would reach a point where I would lose the thread, or it was just so powerful that I would kind of go into what's a state known as samadhi. It was like just blissed out. And I couldn't hold any words, and I would just sit there for 20 minutes. I was trying to contain myself at times when these things would happen on their own accord.
Wow. So those are the books that the Bending Time.
That's right. Yeah. So I published 3 books. Seeds of Light was the first one. And that one was all about an introduction to the Christ consciousness. And then Bending Time sort of really went into taking a lot of those principles, but getting into how time works and why we have such a complicated relationship to time. And then the last one was what felt like a real departure, but was all about kind of like our relationship to kind of social structures, how we in our individual consciousness then go about creating collective structures, and how there's a real disconnect between the way that we often think about social change and trying to sort of correct those things. And I had to then sort of spend the next however many years, 3-4 years, kind of transcribing them, cleaning them up, because it was, sort of written in this like very stream of consciousness. And then like, I go back to sort of correct it. It was like filled with typos and things like that.
But you didn't, like the first, when you were talking about the Christ consciousness in the first book, when it was coming through at the first time, you were just typing. And it was that, were you understanding it after you would read the pages? Was it?
After I would read the pages, I mean, one of the things that as they were talking, they're like, don't try to interrupt, don't try to understand, don't try to grapple with this now. Just really, it's like, you're being a channel right now, like you're just receiving. And, every once in a while I'd be like, I'd have like, it would say something and they would have a question. I would ask a question and I would just transcribe it and be like, what is, and then they would sort of answer. So the first book has a little bit, all of them have a little bit of dialogue. I think the least amount is in the third one. And, it always would surprise me because as much as I was immersed in, the spiritual world, for me, I would not have gravitated to the phrase Christ consciousness.
Okay.
That's not where I would go. It's a beautiful term, but I have my own history with, Catholicism, Christianity,
Right,
like
exactly.
that would not have been the place I would use. I would have preferred a term like unity consciousness or just enlightenment or something. So I was always really surprised. And in a way that I feel I can say, because truly, like I did not come up with these ideas, although there were concepts within me that were, already pre-existing. I was really very taken by surprise with a lot of the insights and discussions of time. I would have never thought to write about those things.
Right. So, because time, I've been wrapping my head around that. That's one of the common themes and some of the questions that I ask in this podcast. And it's taken me probably the last 2 years to where I've like kind of wrapped my head around it. But when I know that that's really a big part of the book that I just read, and being in the present moment, will you explain the way you can explain time? Because it's a beautiful way.
I'd be happy to. So to give a little context for your listeners, bending time was a lot about how much we can manipulate time and how we can learn to stretch it out and we can learn to accelerate it. And the ways in which, we are constantly navigating time, avoiding time, et cetera. My guides don't refer to time as an illusion. They said time is an agreement. And I've always found that a really fascinating way to think about it, because it's basically the idea of like, an agreement for them is kind of like, a constitutive paradigm of the reality that we're in. In other words, as much as we can talk about like, there may not be time from the soul's perspective, we're all living in time. I mean,
Right.
We're all aging, we're going to die, we're going to leave these bodies, and we play with time all the time, right? We're constantly navigating time. We have a history, we have memories, we have an identity. And so while we can't escape time, and the goal isn't to escape time, we can learn to really play with it in a way that's really powerful, recognizing that we have a connection to it. So they don't use the word illusion, although occasionally, I will use the word illusion or illusory. And what I took from all of their teachings, and that's where I ended up with Endless Awakening, was kind of accepting this sort of paradox around time, or I began to see sort of time as this sort of paradox of, we only have the present moment. Every moment that we're experiencing is the present moment, but then we have a memory, which is a recreation, and we have the future, which is, if you want to call it an imagination, it's something that we're creating in our imagination as to what the future may look like. We can't escape time. I mean, and one of the things that I think is really fundamental as a spiritual seeker is to embrace the fact that we will leave our bodies, and that's, there's nothing, no way around that. But as I've like to mention, we within that can play with, our understanding of time. And one of the places where, for me, that it's most helpful is, thinking about the fact that I am only in the present moment. That I know, and we know that being in the now is an incredibly powerful perception. And at the same time, we're actually never really in the present as it is. It's a present that we create. I perceive only so much of the present.
Right.
And everything that I perceive is filtered through my perceptions of what I know. So I'm actually seeing something that is sort of molded by the frameworks that I have that come from the past. And so part of playing with time and playing with our perceptions is learning to sort of slow down and allowing yourself to see what you haven't seen before, and kind of accepting that you're always going to see what you've seen before, and then kind of saying, well, what am I actually not seeing here? Where am I seeing you? This is true, especially of relationships. When I see somebody, how much am I seeing them as a version of somebody who once was? I mean, how they may have changed a lot. So that's it in a nutshell, sort of holding these different concepts of time. There's only the present moment. We're always seeing through the past. There's definitely a future where we leave our bodies, and they're all true.
Right. You talk a lot about, I use the word, you don't use it as much as me. I say limiting beliefs, and, you talk about what you're seeing, right? What I'm seeing right now is the beliefs that I just see it. It's what my perspective is based on what I have programmed into my mind that I believe.
Yes.
And your point of the way you teach is being in the moment. I mean, the way you talked about it at the end of the book about how people are like rushing around to check the bucket list, and like going and like don't waste your time. I mean, there's so many things I could relate to in that moment. Like I have 2 children, and they're in their teenage years now. And I look back and think of, their childhood is, it made me think of how have I been present in their, as a mom, being present in their childhood. That's a huge importance to me. Beautiful. And I've known and been present from before they were in my belly, right? Like I was intentional. I was an older parent, and I just knew. But when you write these words, like, how we live and it's like these words, it's always based in time. Like, oh, we got to hurry. We don't have time. Hurry up. Instead of just like what the thing that I wrote was, let's see, and I've written, and I don't usually do this, but I didn't want to mess it up. But you said our fear of future death. Wait, the bucket. Okay, no time to waste. Slow down. Life is fuller. Yes, life is fuller when you slow down. Like you explain it in a way of like you could just be at peace and in the now. Yeah, and really get into that practice.
Yeah. This is an important practice for me. And part of it is I have my own kind of karmic history that other people who've read me have pointed to, and which is that I do move quickly. As I'm talking with you, I tend to speed up. When I walk in the streets, I am like the fastest walker. My husband's always like, can you walk a little slower? I just have this pace. And I remember getting read by somebody once who was like, yeah, you're almost moving so quickly that you're actually not even seeing what you're supposed to see.
Right.
And 2 experiences in my life really, really brought that message home. One, which I've talked about in the past, was a moment when I was doing all of this work in this intensive work with my teacher. There was a moment that I was standing. I was in a hotel in Manhattan, getting fitted for a custom suit. So I'm sort of standing there, my arms out, sort of measurements happening, and I'm staring at the floor, and the thought just pops into my, because I'm seeing little droplets, and I was like, oh, it's raining, and I'm like, but I'm staring at the floor. I'm not, and all of a sudden I just began to see what looked like, when you get out of the shower and there's kind of mist and there's just like little droplets. Right. That's what I was seeing everywhere. Then I went to a friend of mine who is a beautiful, beautiful psychic medium, Tony Leroy, giving a little plug there for anybody who wants to visit him. And he was like, oh, you're seeing new frequencies of light. And I had never done that before. Something had shifted. And so I was seeing like a little bit different part of reality. And to this day, that's what the world looks like to me. And, I've had my eyes checked. I wear contacts. I mean, the physical realm, but this aspect of reality I hadn't seen before. And it took kind of slowing down of it. And the second was on a meditation retreat where I went for like 9-10 days and really physically slowed down so that the material world that I was taking in, I began to take in so much more data. And all of a sudden I could see details in things that I just never saw before. Everything was so much brighter, so much more intense. And this is by like day 7. I'm like literally eating my meals like this, like an hour to get through because I had slowed down. Even then, I wasn't taking in the whole world, but it was just amazing how much we filter out from day to day. And we just sort of say, I know that, I've seen that before.
Right.
And
yeah, you've changed my perspective for sure. The last couple of days after reading this, it just makes me realize like how many things I miss. And I think I'm all open and, I do taking my dogs on a walk and I'm like, so I feel like have this awareness that I'm soaking it all in, but I'm not like, I was like, wow, I need to go to the next level. I need to be Patrick. Like Patrick's like this example of understanding that when you are that and you realize that there's no separation from anything, that we're all it's all at one.
Right. And you are open. There's, one of the things that I think is really important, because you just said, oh, I have to get to the next level. And it's like, but you are open.
And
you
you
are
do say that
in.
a lot in that book.
Yeah, this is one of the things I really try to emphasize, because, I don't walk around at this like incredible snail pace now, soaking in the world from moment to moment, where I have to meet the world at its pace.
Right.
And I have to accept that, I have to live in separation. And for me, what has come out of that is, in a way, the beauty of separation. We begin with this idea of realizing, oh, I've been living in this realm of separation.
Right.
I'm not one with all. I'm this autonomous being, and you're you, and there's nothing connecting us, and it's just my 5 senses. And we have this incredible capacity to be, whoa, no, that's not it at all. Like, I've had experiences of oneness where, like, all of a sudden I'm the flowers, I'm the landscape. This is amazing, or I'm feeling this incredible energy, or I'm connecting with somebody energetically and realizing, like, this is what's happening all the time. And we are autonomous beings. We still have to live in our bodies and we have to be separate. And that's actually a really beautiful thing. For me, the process sort of coming from separation, where it's like, this is it, to like, oh no, there's this oneness.
Right.
And then coming back to separation, I mean, like, how beautiful is that? I mean, sovereignty, autonomy, your own life, your identity, your sense of your journey. It is separate. And it's beautiful.
Right. What is your meaning of why we came, and why did your soul come into Patrick's body on this time and this planet, on this earth?
It's a great question. There's the standard answer, which I would just say, when I say standard, I feel like, a lot of teachers are like, our souls are here to learn to love and learn these lessons of that we're all one, and then we come back to source and we come back to the divine. And all that's true. So to answer that, though, in a slightly less kind of all one size fits all kind of way, which is, what does it mean? Why did Patrick's soul come in? Which is this wonderful thing, because in a way, you've already hinted at this question, which, because you mentioned like I'd had all these experiences, I've lived these professional lives, they're very intellectual, and then I had this channeling experience. And then I wrote this book. And I'm going to answer your question. I'm not avoiding it. But I wrote this book, and as you said at the beginning, you wrote this book. And it's true, because I have loved my channeled experience as an experience. And I love those books. I have a deep affection and reverence for them, an unbelievably reverence, an unbelievable reverence for having had the experience of being connected to the council. And yet I decided that I didn't want to be, at least for now, I didn't want to be a public channel. Like, I didn't want to be somebody who shows up in channels and like that this is what I do. Mm-hmm. And I can talk about why, but I had my own reluctance around that, and said, you know what? I want to find a different voice. And, council's like, you do you, free will,
right.
There's a sense of destiny, and there's also free will. And so I wrote this book, and I really wanted a voice that sounded like what felt like Patrick, mm-hmm. right? Not sort of Patrick's higher self or any sort of channeled voice. And I think that my journey in this lifetime as Patrick is really finding and embracing all of these aspects of like Patrick as this Spanish professor, Patrick as then the lawyer, and then, he didn't pursue that, but these are parts of me. And understanding the divine and that unity as one that isn't about leaving behind this body, this experience, this identity, or something that's sort of non-material.
Right. So you this is why because there's a part of the book, part of the book where you say, one day you sat and you're like, who's Patrick? Who is Patrick? Like, what, I mean, I wrote it down, but oh yeah, he's nowhere and everywhere.
Right. He's nowhere and everywhere. It was the most incredible thing. And I remember I just like burst out laughing because it was so simple for like this instance where like this whole question of the self and its pursuit dissolved, right? And because so much of our work, and this has been my story too, of who am I? Why am I here? What's my purpose? What does it look like? And I won't pretend that those questions aren't still part of me, right? They may point in different directions. Am I supposed to write another book, or should I be doing something else? What's the way that I'm supposed to be doing this kind of work? There are infinite ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be one way. So I may be playing with those questions. And I think that there's a tendency, and I think this has been my tendency in past lives, of sort of kind of striving to feel like I'm connected to God. And maybe those experiences are the ones where you are blissed out, or the mystical experiences.
Right.
When I've had experiences that showed me that everything happening in my life, all the mundane, boring stuff, was just as magical, but we just didn't experience it that way. So if there's a path for me, it's like, yeah, I'm everywhere and I'm nowhere. It's this experience of a self that's illusory, that kind of holds itself together. But just because it's an illusion doesn't mean it's not also magical, right? Like,
right. When you talk, because you're big on intuition and teaching intuition, mm-hmm. and I know that's, I think of you when you say forgiveness, awareness, and intuition. Those are the three like main centers that you focus on to.
Right. Yeah. Past, present, and future.
Right.
Yeah. How we relate to time. And I learned the hard way, as we discussed, kind of how it is, what life is like when you don't trust your intuition, when you don't feel guided. And the interesting thing is that despite all of my guidance now, which I have, and I really trust my intuition and I really trust the guidance I receive, I don't have a picture of what I look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And I've been told repeatedly, you ain't getting one. Don't even ask for it.
Oh, funny.
There's a lot about putting one foot in front of the other, trust.
Right. Surrender.
Surrender. I'm not in control. And yet I feel the most in control and safe, the least insecure, when I'm only thinking about this moment. And then, in this moment, oh, if I have to plan something, I mean, the future exists. We all have to plan with calendars and do things like that. I
Right.
be aware of tax time and, do the thing.
Right.
But thinking just a few steps ahead and really trusting that.
Right.
Yeah.
But how do you depict, I mean, you talk of, your intuition when you're teaching someone to trust that voice, take that inspired action, move those steps, just keep moving forward, listening, moving.
Yeah.
How do you teach? I mean, I know it's a long process, but what would be one of your tools that you say, this is how you decipher if it's your inner intuition or if it's some voice from your ego, or how do you
Yes.
decipher that?
Hardest thing in the world, right? The hardest thing in the world, unless you've had, unless you're like a channeling experience where you're like, that's not me and I'm being directed, like do such and such. And that happens for me. Am I listening and is it ego or not? And that's in a way, that's something we're all gonna play with and sort of look at. Was it really my intuition, or was it really my ego, or was there some mix in there? And to which I say, you just do your best at any moment to sort of decipher them. But intuition is really about practice and getting to know what it feels like when you've dropped in and you're in that intuitive state versus sort of attempting to logically deduce the steps that you ought to take. And sometimes it happens when people know when they go to the gym and they get in their bodies, or they're like taking a shower and their minds sort of like relax a little bit, and then you have the light bulb moment of like, or that's when you hear the prompt like, I should do this. And those moments you want to hold on to, particularly the moments that when they flash and you feel like a spark, like, that's exciting. What I like to do with people is get them to realize that your intuition you're always taking in information. This is the part where it's like, you're not really separate. You're always taking in information. And sometimes we'll have gut reactions about people, situations. Usually these things happen like very instantaneously, and then the ego comes in as the naysayer. I like to encourage people to practice as much as they can hearing and being guided in very what I like to call no risk situations. And they seem trivial, but it's like doing a little bit of exercise. So I encourage people to change the route to work. Like most of us fall into habits. It's like, we're going to take this road, we're going to take this road, and I'm going to just let yourself be guided.
Yeah,
Just
I do
set
that.
the intention.
Yes. Right.
Or am I going to turn? And you can just feel the pull, like you'll just feel it. Or one of the things I love for people to practice, and most people don't realize that they can do this because it's not considered one of the most important psychic faculties, but the ability to taste something psychically. So when you're in a restaurant, we typically fall into like patterns of like, oh, these are the dishes I like, or I don't know anybody else. I have a sweet tooth, so I love certain things, and I'm a big brownie fiend. I thought about starting my own brownie blog. I love brownies so much. And so But if I go into a bakery and I'm staring at the dessert case, I try to taste these things, not just by appearance, but I like allow it. I'm like, what do I think this is really into? And usually I can tell, like, that's actually going to be sweet, or that's actually going to be dry, or whatever. And I play with it. It's so small, because what's the harm? I mean, you get, you order a meal, it didn't turn out to be so great.
Right.
But you're telling yourself, this is a moment where I can listen. And it doesn't have to be life altering. It doesn't have to be career, relationship, some major part of my business, where if you
Not going to Harvard.
yeah, Harvard, you can do it and the risks are low, and you're telling yourself, I can trust myself. I can listen to this voice, so that when you get to the big decisions, you're like, oh, I know what it feels like to drop in.
Mm-hmm.
That was my course in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, I know that's what you do. You do teach an intuition.
I do teach it.
Yeah. But so how do you describe your higher self? Because I always am, like, in meditation, I'm visualizing my higher self, and is that how you describe your intuition is coming from?
It's so funny you should ask that, because as somebody who's channeled and it feels like, I very feel it in the crown chakra, and it's a very specific kind of energy. When I'm doing kind of, and if I get a download about somebody, that's what it feels like, But if I'm doing intuitive work, if I'm like just sort of connecting with somebody and reading right then and there, it feels a little different. I feel kind of, I would almost describe myself as feeling kind of empty, like I'm not quite here. It's like almost like if you were to see me as like an image that kind of faded a little bit. And it's an interesting feeling, because there's less of me involved, and then there's just this flow of information that comes through, but it's definitely not coming directly from the crown chakra. I would say that when it comes to my higher self, that has been a very different experience. And I know there was a time when I was working with my teacher when I suddenly began to feel this energy sort of coming down, and it felt very different from what I had previously experienced with her or Amma or anybody else. And it was like, wow, I have never felt more alive. And I was just experiencing it. And she's incredibly gifted. And she's like, your higher self is integrating into you. Oh. And it's sort of, I was like, yeah. And I was like, I felt more me than I ever have. Sometimes when you feel this incredible energy, it can feel beautiful, it can feel alive, and it can feel cleansing. This was like, oh, this is sort of the essence of who I am. And it was slightly different. That doesn't happen when I'm reading people, but that was a kind of integrative experience that I had that made me realize that, we are kind of always in connection with our higher self, but our higher self isn't fully in our experience, our lived experience every day.
Huh. Got it.
It does feel like it's a little bit separate from us.
Right? Yeah. And that's why I was asking, like, how to integrate that with connecting your intuition and connecting that connection, I guess, is what I was asking.
Yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with sort of appealing to your higher self for that guidance. Absolutely. It just so happens that that's not typically the way I work when I work psychically. For whatever reason, I don't know. Now that you're asking me, I'm like, why isn't my higher self doing the readings? Why?
But how are you? How do you do the readings? How do you do that? Because
so when I read people, it always begins, and this is the way it's always been. It always begins with a download, a clairaudient. It feels like the counsel. It's very authoritative. It's like, here's what's going on here karmically. This is sort of the background. These are the issues that are coming up, and it's usually big picture stuff, really big picture stuff. I have a really strong sense of people's sort of trauma, the stuff that they haven't resolved, and sort of where they, are avoiding their work, right? That's one of the tricky things on the spiritual path is sort of we want things to be better. We know that things can be really blissful. And I think for me, at least, the spiritual path has been about diving really deep into like the stuff that, you didn't really want to face. And then when I'm with them, when I first read somebody in person, I get a clairvoyant image, and it's always very metaphorical of kind of how they're relating to some major issue or something, a pattern in their life, like a limiting belief, about how they're behaving. And so then I share, and then along the way, people ask questions, and I get, either claircognizant or clairsentient senses of like, oh, you should be careful about this or do that. I'm very careful personally. I don't like to tell people at all. I certainly don't tell people what to do. That's their sovereign right to do what they do. I also feel really strongly that predictive work is very tricky. I'm a big proponent of like helping people to sort of see what is in their lives now and where their work is, and not, telling you what's going to happen 2 years, 3 years from now.
Right.
That's not my area where I typically read people.
You talked about like there's no wrong choice, I always, raising children, that comes up a lot, especially as a teenager and getting ready to go to college, and, talking about the, passions and what you're going to, study, or, and I just, from my background and what, when I can look at my life and the choices that I've made, they've all led to here. They all are the right choice.
Exactly. They're all the right choice.
Right.
Even if at the time you're like, what, or looking back and thinking I made the wrong choice. I have no doubt that, for all of us, we've all done the best we can, and we've made the right choice in the sense that there are no wrong choices. There are infinite paths to our destinations. We may have had choices where we had been given opportunities to learn a lesson, and then we didn't learn it, and then we tried it again, and we didn't learn it, and we tried it again. And sometimes, like with me, where the universe is like, you will wake up, you are going to learn to listen to your intuition. So, here's what's going to happen with Harvard. Bam.
Right.
Thankfully I learned from that.
But if you didn't listen to that intuition and you did go to Harvard and you played that Patrick out,
great question.
Do you feel like there would have been some other path that would have brought, like I always talk about, like the Y's in the road, like that would have been a Y, but it would have brought you back to the yellow brick road that you're following?
Exactly. Absolutely. I absolutely think that's what would have happened. And what may have happened at Harvard or down the road may have been like calamity. I mean, maybe I get there and I'm like really miserable. Maybe there I'm in an accident. Maybe I get sick. Who knows what happens? Whatever it was telling me don't go that way.
Right.
Something terrible, in quotation marks, could have happened. Like so many people, you have experiences in life that seem really devastating at the time. And then you look back and like, oh, that was such a blessing in disguise because it did X, Y, and Z for me. I have no doubt that that's what would have happened. And I've also had my moments when I'm still processing that, where I'm like, why couldn't we gotten there? Like, why do we have to go that way? Couldn't we have gotten the lesson a little bit easier? To which, I'm reminded, like, well, you did have a lot of psychics and things show up in your life and you rolled your eyes, like you did, you were like, no, I'm not going to deal with that. Until, basically, as my friend Tony said, the universe hit you upside with a frying pan, because that's what it took for, lawyer Patrick to wake up.
Oh my gosh. When you think of how, life and why we came here, and the lessons, we're here to learn lessons and grow. And do you believe that after we die, tell me where we go and what's death to you?
Yeah. It's so
Because
great that
that's
you
your
asked that.
last chapter, right?
Yeah.
Yes, your time. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of part of the, I mean, this is all part of the book, but I haven't gone down like a organized, but it's all good.
No, that's great. Because that's one of the areas that I've thought a lot about. And, if I were to rewrite that chapter today, I might put a little bit more emphasis on, sort of what comes after, what I've been told comes after, what I believe comes after, which is, I do believe that our consciousness survives in some way, and we go on and we have a life review, and we meet loved ones, and we have a whole other experience there. And part of that is, from what I've been told in terms of the guidance I've received, divinely, counsel, other teachers, my experience with mediums. And at the same time, and I think this is part of going back to your question about, what is Patrick's life purpose here, is I don't want to live for the afterlife. Neither in a sort of like, oh, I need to accrue really all the good karma in the world so that I get to, heaven. So I'm not operating from a, that kind of perspective.
Right.
But I also don't want to not be fully here, because I think, oh, it's all gonna be fine. I mean, who cares? I'll die, and the afterlife will be great. It will be. That I'm not concerned about. And yet, I don't know what it's like to live outside of a body, right? Like this is,
Right.
We talk about being outside of God. I don't know what it's like. And I talk about it in the book. I mean, do we appear as ghosts? I personally have never seen a ghost. Are we operating in some realm? What does it look like? I don't know. And so I don't want this certainty about what the afterlife is going to be like, so that I don't pay attention to my material world. And part of that is that I don't want to short circuit a fear of death. I think one of the most powerful things that anybody can do is really face the fear of death. And I won't say here that I've conquered my fear of death, but really looking at it and being like, that's it. I don't know what comes after, because then there's a real preciousness to life. Like, I don't want this to be like, this is just sort of, a prologue to the really good stuff, and I'm just getting through it, right?
Right.
Like,
Exactly.
Whatever happens, fine. A bus knocks me out, fine, I'll finally make it to heaven. No, I want this life to feel really precious. I mean, that's the part that I keep coming back to again and again, of kind of it sounds so, it's very hard for me to say it without, I think, sounding almost, I don't know, Disney-esque, but there's just something about the magic of like really everyday life that, like, I think I saw a meme once that I thought, like, oh yeah, of like, you've died and you're now in the afterlife, and everyone's asking, so how is heaven? Like, yes.
Oh, funny. I
So,
love that.
when we talk about, as we often do, about, our purpose here being creating heaven on earth, which sometimes takes the form of we need to remodel our social sphere and change, we have got all this stuff. The world seems like really crazy and chaotic and all that sort of stuff. All true.
Right.
And imagine that this world is like utter magic.
Right.
And to not lose that perspective in the midst of the chaos and all of that.
Yeah. And I know, because I think when I said the timing of your book and where we're at in this, life, in 2023 now, and how the division and, how we've watched since 2020, this divide, but the way you have this amazing way of just looking at it as, gosh, I mean, that's perfect and that's perfect. Let's live and look at it like it's magic. It's all, we get to be here and experience it. And that's their perspective and that's their perspective. It's perfect.
Yeah, it's perfect. And I can hold that paradoxically with, perspectives of like, that's really cruel and that's really painful
Right.
and that's really suffering. Like not living in a kind of like, that's why I kind of mentioned Disney. So like pretending somehow that
Right.
the world isn't full of like pain and
Exactly.
suffering and that there are lots of things that we can do differently. And looking at all of that and kind of going, I can understand why, in the same way that when we can look at ourselves and go really deep into our traumas and our past history, which I know you've talked about with a lot of your guests, and that's a huge part of the path, is to look at the world and be like, me looking internally at the, first grader in Utah who felt utterly ashamed, or any of the other countless childhood experiences, is actually no different from looking out at the world and going, whoa, what is going on here?
Right.
Like all these people doing all these sort of horrible things to each other. You're like, that's the same thing. If we're talking no separation, it's like,
Right.
this is part of me, and now I have to meet it. How do I meet that compassionately, lovingly, not pretending it's not there? And that's a big question. I don't think I'm doing justice to it now, but it's when I say it's perfect, I don't want your listeners to think that I'm like, nothing's happening in the world.
Right. No, exactly.
Yeah.
No, I mean, you were talking about one thing, like, there's children in cages and, we're not,
Yes.
there, or if you don't like that president, go vote, do something. If
Right.
that makes you feel like you can help that situation,
Absolutely.
we're not throwing it under the rug.
Yeah.
It's
No.
not like that. And I want, that's for sure, that I'm not talking about everything's perfect and we're living at Disneyland, but if you can look at and so I guess it's judgment is
Mhm.
the word.
Yeah.
I'm not judging the way they're viewing life. If that's where they're supposed to learn and do those things, I'm not turning my face from it. If I want to help, do something about it,
Right.
then I have the will to do that.
Exactly. There's a moment where something that shows up in your life as information, as something happening in the world, and you're going to have an emotional reaction to it. And it may be that, that's showing up in your life as something where it's like, I'm having an emotional reaction to that. What is my reaction? Is it to push it aside? Well, there's probably a lesson there for you of not pushing away painful
Right.
things in the world. Or maybe there's a moment where you're like, wow, I feel inspired to do something about that. Like it's a wake-up call. Or just recognizing, like, I think one of the most common reactions is for people to either look at the world and kind of fall into outrage, like that's
Right.
outrageous, or, condemnation, like they're horrible, da, da, da. Yes, there's suffering there, but it's like, can you take a moment to understand how those situations arose? Like, can you get curious about it? We do that in meditation all the time. It's sort of like, I'm feeling something really painful. I learn to get curious about it. Inquiry, we dive in. Can you do that with the world without, pushing it away, rejecting it, giving it the back of your hand?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. On that note, we are at the end. There was one question it's been stirring in my head, and I just have to ask you, what the council, will you explain, are they entities that have been humans before? How do they describe themselves?
Right. So when I first started channeling and I was very curious about it, I asked them and they were like, we're a collective of, kind of ascended masters of light beings who guide humanity's evolution. And I later learned I'm not the only one in contact with them. There are a bunch of people out there who've written books, who are connected with them.
When you say them, is it millions? Is it 100?
They've
Is
never
there
given me a
3?
number, and I've asked, and I went to my friend Tony to give him his final third plug, and I was like, Tony, what is it? And he's like, it feels like a real collective of people of which your soul is a part. Like soul is connected to this group, and they've never given me a full picture description. At one time I asked, can I speak to individual members? And they're like, no, that's not your role. Like, you don't get to
Okay.
choose. And, some people are like, I want to talk to Jesus, or I want to talk to the Buddha, like people want to talk to specific figures. Then they've never given me the sense of being archangels. My sense of them is that they all have been, or most of them have been incarnated as human.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I have, had my own personal relationship to angelic beings, and certainly like foster that. And it's a beautiful thing. But there's something that feels very, like I said, divine father about it. It does feel collective in the sense that individual identity, because this is a big theme in there in the work that they do, and which I've brought into, and is how much our individual identities do get in the way of, based on how we behave. We get very defensive, and we sort of get very rigid around our identities. And I think that there's in essence a teaching in the sort of like, it's collective, and it's an understanding that it's sort of not than one being, right? Like, it's not God.
Right.
There's some sense of individuation of like prior experiences, but that by being a collective, I don't need to talk to them individually. So they've always spoken in a we, and they won't give me individual identities. And so,
But do you feel like when you go to heaven, you're going to be part of that council with someone else that has come to incarnate in a body, and now you're going to be part of that council?
It's funny. I'm actually quite stunned by your question, Ashley. That's such a beautiful question, because, in all of the time that I've never asked that. It's never even occurred to me.
Oh,
Because, and I guess this goes back to our prior discussion about the afterlife. I really do try to lead my life with the sense of having as soft a footprint as I can, of doing no harm, of clearing karma, not having unresolved issues. But do I know that I'm not going to reincarnate? Like, is my soul done?
right.
Like, is that the end of the road for this soul? I mean, I imagine it's sort of like Patrick gets to go somewhere. My soul's like, well, Patrick didn't do X, Y, and Z, and so now we're going to go do that. So it's interesting. I'll have to see if I can get an answer as to whether that, and maybe I'm not supposed to know, like, what would my life be like if I was told, oh yeah, this is your final life, nothing to worry about.
Right.
Yeah.
But if we don't have time and we're everywhere at once, so maybe you are part of the council.
Maybe
And
the higher self is like, me already. And then this is exactly, that's the beauty of time, and there being no time is, for them. And they're very clear, like, for them, time, like they don't experience time the way we do. That, moments that I've had where I felt like I was getting something. I mean, do you know the movie Interstellar?
no, but I've
Oh.
heard of it.
Yeah, so there's this wonderful moment early when Matthew McConaughey is in this shuttle, and they're sort of heading to a black hole, and it looks like there's this sort of light being outside the shuttle, and it's like they're like first contact. And then later in the movie, because he's sort of gone to a black hole and he's like shifted in time, and like it turns out it's him. It's his future self touching him, and time has sort of folded on itself. So I feel like it's sort of like that. My moments with my higher self might be like, future me looking back.
You talk about a couple movies. I'm going over, and I'm really sorry, but I could talk to you forever.
It's fine by me.
Okay, good.
And we can continue as long as you want. That is
okay. I just wanted to ask you, because you brought up movies, and you do reference a couple movies, and I thought that's kind of fun when you said that map of tiny perfect things, it was in 2021.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that movie, but explain that movie and how it relates to what you are trying to teach and what you believe.
So that was, I think, an Amazon Prime movie
Oh,
that I just happened to come across in one of those, sort of serendipitous, synchronistic ways. It's a very sweet movie about a moment when suddenly it appears that there's a protagonist who's caught in a time loop. And sort of every day, it's a little Groundhog Day. Wakes up, the world is the same, is living the same thing. And then he finally meets somebody else, a young woman who's also aware of time. Everybody else is unaware that they're reliving the same day over and over. And they start hanging out, and they start realizing that there's all these things, apropos of our discussion of slowing down, they don't see in that day, that when they start to see them, they're like, oh, look at all these little miracles that are happening all the time. And they start to map it out. And they have to rebuild the map every day. And for them, they come to an understanding or a belief that if they can map all of them, they'll get out of this time loop, that this is sort of like
okay.
the unity. And so they go around doing that. It's actually really perfect that you've asked about that, because behind all of that is this idea of mastery. We will complete all of this. We'll get the map. It'll be perfect. And they get everything, and they're still stuck. And they don't realize it until they realize why they got stuck. And it was her, not the protagonist, who we thought was the protagonist, the guy. Woman, her mother's dying, and she doesn't want to let go. And I'm actually getting like kind of a little bit clumped as I think about it, because then there's finally this conversation where she realizes like they're reliving this and they're trying to create this perfect moment. And it has taught them to see these miracles in everyday life. But it was really about letting go of and accepting death, right? That suddenly in letting go and accepting death, and the mother who has cancer, and the daughter says, what would you do differently? And she's like, nothing. It was all perfect. And it was just this time loop that allowed them to see the perfection that they didn't see. So in a way, your question is just so beautiful, because it's really sort of brought all these threads together of coming back to, for me, seeing the miracle of just everyday life by accepting that we're all going to die at some point. And we may look at this and go, wow, we were in heaven all along.
I love it. And on that note, I feel complete. Not really, Patrick. You're amazing. And I so much enjoyed meeting you and studying your book and learning about you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ashley. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. And I just, I could talk to you for hours, but, we,
there's no time.
there's no time, but, on the other hand, yes.
I've got to go pick the girls up from school.
Thank you so much for having me on your show today.
You're so welcome. So it's patrickpaulgarlinger.com. And you can go on Amazon and get all of his books. Just put his name in and all of his books come up.
Thank you.
Right. You're so welcome.